The first thing Owen Hartwell saw was a pair of tiny footprints pressed into the silver dust earth of the pass, then a child, swaying alone at the edge of the creek as if the desert wind might blow her away. Her dress hung in tatters, her skin scraped raw, and her dark eyes stared at nothing, emptied by more fear than any child should have known. For a breath, Owen couldn't move. The sight hit him like a bullet fired straight from his past, dragging up the memory of a little boy he once carried through fevers that never broke. Then the girl's knees buckled. Owen was off his horse before thought caught up with instinct, boots pounding across the stones, when he caught her in his arms. Her weight was shockingly light, as if she had survived this far by sheer will alone. And in that moment, Owen understood one thing with absolute clarity: he was not going to lose another child. Silver Creek Pass lay stretched beneath the late afternoon sun, its narrow spine of rock dividing Arizona from the New Mexico territory. The wind carried the dry scent of juniper and warm stone, whistling low through the crevices as if whispering old stories of riders and lost battles. Below the ridge, the creek glimmered like a strip of hammered silver, slipping over dark stones, the only softness in a land carved by time and hunger. Every sound felt sharper here: the crack of settling rocks, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of dry grass brushing against itself. Just beyond the creek stood a lone cabin of weathered pine, its roof patched with mismatched boards, its windows fogged with dust. It clung to the land like a stubborn root, half forgotten by the nearest town and too far from any neighbor to hear a voice carried on the wind. Behind it, in the shade of an old cottonwood, lay two graves marked only by smooth stones. The names had long been washed by rain, but Owen Hartwell didn't need the markers to remember. His wife rested there, gone in the same hour she gave life to the child he held trembling in his arms years ago. And the child, a boy with bright eyes and a laugh that once filled this valley, lay beside her, taken by a sickness no doctor could stop. Owen lived now with the silence that followed them, a man worn by sun, sorrow, and the quiet weight of years spent alone. His shoulders were broad, but carried a heaviness deeper than bone. His beard had grown untamed, hiding much of the face that once held youth, yet his eyes gray, steady, unguarded when he forgot to shield them, told every story he tried to bury. In the breast pocket of his coat, he kept a small folded handkerchief embroidered with a child's initials. He never spoke of it, but he never rode without it, far from the cabin. Somewhere among the broken hills, another life was carving its way back toward him. Talina moved through the wilderness with steps both weary and determined, her breath thin from days of searching. Fringes of her deerskin dress clung to her legs, torn from running through thickets. Her dark hair, once braided with care, now hung loose, tangled by wind and grief. But her eyes black, fierce, burning, carried the fire of a mother who would cross any desert to find the child stolen from her arms in the chaos of an attack. The land held them all in its vast hands: a grieving man, a wandering mother, and a child caught between loss and survival. Silver Creek Pass waited in its stillness, knowing that, before nightfall, 3 lives, each broken in different ways, would be drawn together beneath its silver light, for 2 days and nights. The little girl slept in Owen's cabin as if her body had finally been granted permission to collapse. Owen kept the fire alive, fed her spoonfuls of broth, washed the dust and blood from her scratches, and wrapped her in the softest quilt he owned. Yet she never spoke. She only watched him with wide, haunted eyes, clutching the ragged doll he had offered her, one stitched long ago for a child who never grew old enough to hold it. On the third evening, as the sun dipped low and spread a muted orange across the pass, the girl stirred suddenly. Her head snapped toward the ridge, small fingers tightening around the doll. Owen set aside the bucket he was carrying and followed her gaze. A shadow moved along the rock, stumbling, swaying, almost folding into the dust with each step. The girl rose shakily and took 2 unsteady steps toward the door. Owen knelt in front of her, blocking her path for a moment, but her expression, fear, and hope tangled so tightly he couldn't tell one from the other, made him step aside. The figure on the ridge descended, slipping on loose shale, catching herself on trembling hands. As she drew closer, the fading light revealed her, a woman with bronze skin, streaked by sweat and dust. Her dress torn at the seams, her hair unbraided and wild from days of running. She looked as though she had crossed every mile of this land on nothing but desperation. But her eyes, sharp, black, unbroken, searched the pass with the ferocity of a mother who refused to accept a world where her child no longer breathed. The girl bolted forward with a sound that wasn't quite a cry, wasn't quite a laugh. Talina fell to her knees just in time to catch her, arms closing around the small body as if she feared the world might steal her again. The woman pressed her face into her daughter's hair, whispering in Apache, her voice cracked and trembling. Tala clung to her with both arms, burying herself into the familiar warmth she had been torn away from. Owen approached slowly, hands open at his sides to show he meant no threat. Talina's head snapped up. For a moment, her eyes were pure steel, the wary glint of someone who had learned to expect danger from every direction, especially from a white man standing this close to her child. He stopped several paces away. She was alone. He said quietly, "I found her down by the creek." Talina tightened her hold on Tala, pulling the child a little behind her as she shifted her body in a subtle defense. But Tala peeked around her mother's arm and held up the rag doll, as if presenting proof of kindness. Talina's rigid expression wavered. Her gaze moved to Owen's rough coat, the quilt draped over the girl's shoulders, the faint smell of broth still clinging to her. She studied him the way a wounded creature studies an open hand, uncertain, but searching for truth. "You keep her safe," she said at last, her English broken but steady. Owen nodded once. Talina rose unsteadily, still gripping Tala's hand, when she swayed. Owen stepped forward on instinct, hands lifted as if to steady her. She flinched before he could touch her, just a small twitch of the shoulders, but enough to remind him of all the hurt she must have endured. He lowered his hand. "I've got food," he murmured, "and a fire for a heartbeat." Talina hesitated. Then, holding Tala close, she followed him toward the small cabin under the cottonwood tree, wary but willing to step inside the warmth he offered. The days that followed settled over Silver Creek Pass like a slow-moving sunrise, quiet, cautious, and carrying a warmth none of them dared name yet. Talina and Tala slept on the quilt near the hearth, where the fire softened the cold nights pouring down from the ridge. Owen rose before dawn as always, but now the cabin felt different when he stepped outside. There were small breaths inside, 2 sets instead of none, and that alone changed the way he listened to the wind. Talina kept her distance at first. She moved with a silent, measured grace, watching Owen the way someone who has survived too much watches the world alert to every shift of tone, every movement of his hands, yet she repaid every act of kindness with quiet diligence. On the second morning, Owen found the torn cuff of his work shirt neatly mended, folded on the table beside the coffee pot. Talina said nothing when he looked at her. She merely dipped her head once, as if acknowledging an unspoken exchange. Tala adjusted even faster. Children often sensed what adults took longer to understand. She followed Owen around the yard, her small feet padding behind him while he chopped wood or checked the water barrels. She didn't speak, but she had begun to hum a soft, wandering tune that drifted in and out like the breeze. One afternoon, as Owen lifted a bucket from the well, she reached up and placed her small hand against his sleeve, then slipped it back toward her doll without waiting for a response. The touch stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. Inside the cabin, Talina prepared soups from dried herbs she carried in a small pouch. The fragrance of sage and wild mint filled the air, mingling with the smell of pine smoke. Owen wasn't used to sharing meals, but he found himself lingering at the table longer than necessary. Talina never ate until Tala had taken the first bite. Watching them, mother and daughter, reunited after terror, stirred something deep in him, something he had tried to bury alongside the graves beneath the cottonwood. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the pass, Talina carried a bundle of washed clothes toward the creek. Owen followed at a distance, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, the way he had once done with his own son. Talina knelt by the water, rinsing fabric with steady hands. The creek caught the last of the light, turning her reflection into a moving strip of golden shadow. She paused, the wet cloth clinging to her fingers, and for the first time she spoke without being prompted. "My husband," she said quietly, eyes on the water. "He fought to protect our people. They came at night, fire, shouting. We ran." Her voice thinned. Tala fell. I looked back, and she was gone. Owen didn't speak. The land itself seemed to hold still around them. "I searched," she continued. 2 days, 3, no sleep, no food. She pressed the cloth into the water until her knuckles whitened. "I thought she was dead." "You didn't stop looking," Owen said softly. Talina glanced at him, then not with suspicion, not with gratitude, but with something like recognition. A bond formed not from shared language, but from shared loss. Night by night, that recognition grew. There were moments when their hands brushed while passing a bowl. Moments when Talina's gaze softened when she saw Owen help Tala tuck the doll beneath her blanket. And there were moments when Owen caught himself watching Talina as she braided her hair again, slow and deliberate, reclaiming some part of herself that had been stripped away by fear. But still, there was distance, an invisible line Owen refused to cross. He kept his voice measured, his eyes guarded, his steps careful, as if any closeness would crumble the fragile equilibrium he had built since burying his family. Talina sensed it. She, too, held herself back, unsure if this cabin was a temporary shelter or the beginning of something neither of them had chosen, but both might need. One night, a storm rolled across the pass, thick with wind and cold. Tala whimpered in her sleep, twisting beneath the quilt. Talina soothed her with hushed whispers, her hands stroking her daughter's hair. The fire snapped, sending sparks upward. Owen watched from his chair, feeling a familiar ache press against his ribs, the longing for a life he told himself he no longer deserved. As the storm eased, Tala's breathing steadied. Talina leaned back against the wall, exhaustion softening her features. The firelight caught on her cheek, revealing a single tear she didn't bother to wipe away. Owen rose without thinking and draped an extra blanket over her shoulders. She stiffened at the touch, then slowly relaxed beneath it. When she looked up at him, their eyes met for a long, unguarded moment. Talina broke the gaze first. "You carry sorrow," she murmured. Owen swallowed. "We all do." She nodded, accepting the truth in his restraint. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was beginning to take shape. The outline of a connection that neither dared touch, but neither wanted to lose. Outside, the storm faded into distant thunder. Inside, in the flickering glow of the hearth, three people, once strangers, scattered by. Grief began, inch by inch, to breathe the same quiet air, unaware that the peace they were building would soon be tested by the wildness of the land they called home. By the time spring winds sharpened along Silver Creek Pass, the rhythm inside Owen's cabin had begun to feel almost like a heartbeat. Tala woke first each morning, padding across the wooden floor with her doll tucked under one arm. Talina brewed tea from her pouch of desert herbs. Owen stepped outside to check the horses in the fence line, returning to the warmth of a place that no longer felt hollow. He didn't recognize how deeply they had settled into him until the afternoon everything almost shattered. The day had started quietly. A thin veil of clouds softened the sun, and the pass carried an uneasy stillness, the kind that made animals alert and set instincts on edge. Owen tightened the last board on the corral, glancing every so often toward the cabin where Talina gathered fallen branches for the fire. Tala sat in the dust a few yards away, humming to herself while drawing in the dirt with a stick. The wind shifted. It was subtle, a single breath of cold air sweeping down from the upper ridge. Owen paused, the hammer halfway raised. Something in the land changed texture. The birds stopped calling. Even the creek seemed to hush its silver voice. That was when he heard the low growl. It came from the brush behind the cabin, a sound heavy with hunger, threaded with warning, before the next heartbeat. A coyote emerged from the shadow of the rocks, not the usual skittish kind that fled at the sight of a man. This one was gaunt from winter, ribs sharp beneath its fur, eyes fixed on the smallest body in the yard. Tala. She froze, stick falling from her fingers. Talina's breath caught sharp behind her, a strangled sound between fear and a mother's instinctive call. But Owen moved first. He didn't think, only reacted. Every buried instinct he had tried to suffocate for years erupted at once. He ran, boots pounding, heart slamming against his ribs. He grabbed the nearest length of firewood leaning against the fence and planted himself between Tala and the advancing animal. The coyote lunged. Owen swung the wood hard, striking the ground with a force that sent dust flying. The animal skidded back, teeth bared. He yelled a raw, guttural sound meant to claim the space and drive the beast off. The coyote paced, circling, testing him. Its eyes darted to Tala again. "Get back!" Owen's voice tore through the stillness. Talina swept Tala into her arms, stumbling toward the cabin door. The coyote lunged again. Owen thrust forward, jabbing the stick close enough to graze its shoulder. After a tense standoff, the animal gave a final snarl and darted away, disappearing into the rocks with a whipping tail of dust. Only then did Owen feel the tremor in his arms. He turned. Tala's face was buried in her mother's chest, shoulders shaking. Talina held her tightly, murmuring in Apache, a soft stream of words that carried more desperation than comfort. Owen approached slowly, kneeling so he didn't tower over them. Tala peeked up at him, eyes still wet, breathing in small, frightened gulps. And then she reached for him, her little hands stretched out, grasping his coat. She leaned forward toward his chest, as though the fear inside her could only settle in the presence of the man who had stood between her and the teeth of the wild. Her voice trembled when she spoke, barely a whisper. "Pa!" The word broke something inside him cleanly, brutally. It struck with the precision of a blade sliding into the softest part of the ribs. Owen jerked as if hit. The world around him blurred. The creek, the pass, even the heat of the afternoon fading beneath a memory he had spent years trying to drown. A boy's voice, fevered breathing, the weight of a small hand slipping from his. Talina saw it, saw everything collapse in his eyes. She stepped toward him, but Owen stood abruptly, breath unsteady, backing away as if the ground beneath him had turned to shifting sand. Talina whispered something to Tala, then guided her inside the cabin. Owen remained outside, gripping the fence rail until his knuckles whitened. The wind had picked up again, rattling the boards, carrying with it the echo of a name he hadn't heard in years. When the sun finally dipped, and the creek's silver faded into indigo, Owen forced himself back inside. Talina sat by the hearth, Tala asleep in her lap. The fire cast their shadows long across the floor. Owen lowered himself onto the chair opposite her, elbows on his knees, hands woven tightly together. For a long time, neither spoke. "You saved her," Talina said softly, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Not many men would do that for a child not their own." Owen shook his head, jaw tight. "I didn't think." His voice cracked. "I just moved because you cared." He swallowed hard, throat burning. "I've cared before," he said, the admission spilling out rough and unsteady. "I loved my wife. I loved my boy." He stared at his hands, seeing other small hands in their place. "Both of them left me, not because they wanted to, but because life took them anyway. And his breath caught. "I don't know if I can hold on to anyone again. Every time I do, I lose them." Talina watched him with the stillness of someone who knows pain intimately. Then she rose, careful not to wake Tala, and came to stand before him. She reached out, took his shaking hand, and guided it to her chest, placing his palm over her heartbeat. Her voice was quiet, but unbreakable. "We are here," she said, "and we want to stay." Owen closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he let the trembling inside him surface, let it pass through his body instead of burying it under silence. Talina stayed there, her hand over his, grounding him. The wildfire of panic inside him slowly softened, replaced by something fragile, warm, frighteningly alive. Outside, the pass exhaled, the night settled, and inside the small cabin, beneath the cottonwood tree, three souls discovered that sometimes the wild doesn't take, it gives back. Night settled deep over Silver Creek Pass, darker than ink and quieter than prayer. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting a soft amber glow across the cabin walls. Tala slept curled on the quilt beside the flames, her small breaths even now, the rag doll tucked beneath her chin. Talina knelt to smooth her daughter's hair before easing herself up and settling near Owen, who remained seated in his chair, shoulders slumped as though the weight of the entire pass pressed upon them. For a moment, neither spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence, more like the hush after a storm, when the world waits to see what remains standing. Talina watched Owen's profile lit by the fire. The harsh lines of his face had softened, and without his usual guardedness, he looked almost younger, almost the man he might have been before grief hollowed him out. "You don't have to speak," she said quietly. But Owen shook his head. "I do." He stared into the fire, the embers shifting like restless memories. "When my wife died," he began, voice thick, "I thought that was the worst a man could suffer. But losing my boy, watching him fade in my arms," his breath tightened. "It made me believe something was wrong with me, that caring for someone was the same as inviting their loss." Talina didn't look away. Her eyes held the steady strength of someone who had walked through fire and lived. "That fear," she murmured, "is the mark of a good heart. Only those who love deeply fear deeply." Owen let out a shaky breath. "But when Tala called me," he swallowed hard, "I heard my son's voice. It nearly dropped me to my knees." Talina moved closer, her knee brushing his. "You stood for her," she said. "You faced danger without thinking. That is not fear. That is courage your grief tried to bury." He glanced at her, then the first true, searching look he had given her since the coyote came snarling out of the rocks. Talina held his gaze with unwavering calm. "And you," he asked softly, "what did you bury?" Talina lowered her eyes for a moment, tracing a groove in the wooden floor with her thumb. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but strong. "I buried a husband," she said, "who died protecting our people. I buried a home burned in the night. But the hardest thing," she paused, breath catching, "was burying the hope that Tala was alive. Each sunrise, I told myself she was gone. But each sunset, I walked again, unable to stop my feet." She lifted her gaze to him. "When I saw her in your arms, you gave her back to me, and without knowing, you gave me back something I had long buried: faith." Owen blinked against the sudden sting behind his eyes. "I didn't save her alone," he said. "She held on long enough for me to find her. And now," Talina whispered, "she is holding on to you." The fire crackled between them, a soft pop that made Tala stir on the quilt. Owen glanced at the child, and something inside him eased, not fully healed, not yet, but no longer raw. Talina followed his gaze. "She calls you what she feels," she said gently. "But you don't have to be her father if your heart is not ready." Owen exhaled slowly. "Maybe I'm more ready than I thought." Talina reached for his hand again, this time not guiding it to her chest, not urging clarity, but simply holding it. Her fingers were warm, steady, patient. "We build slowly," she said, "like fire from embers." Owen nodded, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a small, unconscious motion. "Then we build," he murmured. Talina leaned her forehead against his shoulder, her voice barely above a breath. "We survived the night, all three of us. That is enough for now, and for the first time since losing his family." Owen allowed himself to believe her, allowed himself to feel the promise inside her words, allowed himself to sit in the quiet with a woman who had lost as much as he had, and yet still chose to stay. Outside, the creek whispered over the stones, a soft silver lullaby, carrying through the open cracks of the cabin. Inside, Owen and Talina sat together in the flicker of the dying fire, the space between them no longer empty, but full of something fragile and new, something that felt like the first breath of a life returning. Morning crept gently into Silver Creek Pass, the first light slipping between the ridges like soft spilled gold. Owen woke to the quiet rustle of movement and found Talina already tending the fire, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. Tala sat beside her mother, tracing patterns in the dust with a sleepy, contented hum. The rag doll perched in her lap like a tiny guardian. The cabin felt different, still small, still worn by years of wind and weather, but filled now with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Owen stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. The land stretched out before him, the creek shimmering as if touched by molten silver. He felt something settle deep inside him, not heavy like grief, but grounding, like a truth he had spent years avoiding finally finding its rightful place. He spent the morning building, from old planks and sturdy pine. Owen shaped a small bed frame beside his own. He sanded the edges smooth, carved a simple pattern near the headboard, a tiny wolf for Tala, because that name would always mean strength to him now. Talina approached quietly, her steps soft. She carried a blanket she had been stitching since dawn, decorated with subtle Apache patterns woven from scraps of cloth. "For her," she said. Owen nodded, placing the finished frame into its spot. When Tala saw it, her eyes widened with joy, so pure it made his chest ache. She ran her hands across the carved wolf, whispered something in Apache, then flung her arms around both adults as if she understood perfectly that this bed meant she finally had a home. That evening, they shared a simple stew, eaten slowly as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Tala drifted to sleep on her new bed, breathing steady. Talina sat beside Owen on the steps of the cabin, the silver glow of the creek lighting their faces. "This place," she murmured. "It feels safe." Owen looked at her, then at the small figure sleeping peacefully inside. "It is," he said softly, "as long as we're here together." The wind carried the scent of sage across the pass. The creek shimmered under the rising moon, as if blessing the new life quietly forming there. Silver Creek Pass, once a place of loneliness, now held the fragile shape of belonging, a home rebuilt not from what was lost, but from what had been found again.